12 commercial vessels, $3 billion in ships and cargo, 40 Russian naval assets deployed with military precision across 3 separate maritime theaters, and hundreds of civilian sailors, men, and women who woke up expecting another routine day at sea, now sitting in Russian custody, reclassified from commercial crew members to material witnesses in investigations they cannot comprehend, caught in a geopolitical storm they never saw coming. But here is what should truly terrify you. What should keep every strategic thinker in Washington awake at night? What represents the most dangerous dimension of this crisis? This was not impulsive retaliation. This was not emotional reaction. This was calculated, methodical, precisely orchestrated strategy. And the most disturbing truth of all, the fact that no one in our government wants to acknowledge, is that we taught them how to do it. We provided the blueprint. We established the precedent. We demonstrated that commercial shipping could be weaponized, that international law could be selectively enforced, that economic coercion could cross into physical seizure of vessels, and now Russia has learned the lesson and applied it with devastating effectiveness. Let me describe what transpired in the waters surrounding Russia over recent weeks, because the scale and coordination of these operations reveals strategic planning that should have been anticipated, but somehow caught Western intelligence completely off guard. Russian naval forces operating with the kind of synchronized precision normally, reserved for major military exercises, executed simultaneous seizures of oil, tankers and liquefied natural gas carriers across geographically dispersed maritime zones, the Black Sea, where Russian naval dominance has been contested since the invasion of Ukraine. The Baltic approaches those critical shipping lanes connecting Scandinavia to Central Europe. The Arctic shipping routes, increasingly vital as climate change opens northern passages that were previously impassable. 3 distinct theaters, 12 vessels, 1 coordinated operation that demonstrates capabilities our analysts apparently underestimated. American-operated vessels seized, Allied flagships taken into custody, cargoes worth hundreds of millions per vessel now sitting immobile in Russian ports, and the legal justifications. This is what makes the situation so strategically complex, constructed with such careful attention to international maritime law that our own government lawyers are still parsing the language, still debating whether Russia has technically violated treaties or merely exploited ambiguities that have always existed but were never tested in this manner. The immediate reaction in Western capitals followed entirely predictable patterns. Outrage expressed through official statements, emergency meetings convened at ministerial levels, threats of consequences issued through diplomatic channels, strong words about unacceptable behavior and violations of international norms, all the theatrical elements of crisis response performed with appropriate gravity. But I have observed American foreign policy machinery for long enough to recognize the difference between performative outrage and genuine strategic surprise. And this time, behind the carefully crafted statements and the coordinated messaging, the shock was authentic. Our officials were genuinely caught off guard. They did not see this coming. They did not war game this scenario. They did not prepare contingency responses. And that reality, that failure of strategic imagination, should concern you far more than the actual vessel seizures. It means our intelligence apparatus failed. Our strategic planning failed. Our ability to think several moves ahead in great power competition failed. It means that despite spending more on defense and intelligence than the next 10 nations combined, despite maintaining the most sophisticated analytical capabilities in human history, despite access to satellite surveillance and signals, intelligence, and human sources, we somehow failed to anticipate what any careful observer of Russian behavior patterns should have predicted. Now, Let me challenge a fundamental assumption that you almost certainly hold an assumption so deeply, embedded in our understanding of how the modern world functions, that you probably have never even consciously examined it. You believe, as most people believe, as I believed for most of my career, that international maritime law protects commercial shipping. That rules exist, codified in treaties, ratified by nearly every nation, establishing that merchant vessels sailing under legitimate flags, carrying legal cargoes, enjoy protections, even during periods of political tension between their home nations and coastal states. Those rules do exist. They are written in documents negotiated over decades. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the International Maritime Organization conventions, bilateral and multilateral agreements governing everything from navigation rights to environmental standards, the entire elaborate architecture of international maritime law. But here is what you must understand. What recent events have demonstrated with brutal clarity: rules only matter when someone possesses both the capability and the willingness to enforce them. And when enforcement itself becomes weaponized, when the machinery designed to uphold rules gets repurposed as an instrument of coercion, the rules transform into something entirely different. They become not protections, but vulnerabilities. They become not shields, but targets. They become not foundations of predictable commerce, but tools of unpredictable warfare. The true story, the narrative that explains how we arrived at this crisis, begins not in recent weeks, but in late 2022, in the months following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when Western powers led by the United States and European Union unleashed what was described with considerable self-satisfaction as the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. The scope was indeed unprecedented. Disconnection from SWIFT, the international banking system that processes the vast majority of global financial transactions. Central bank asset freezes totaling hundreds of billions of dollars, export controls on advanced technology, travel bans on oligarchs and officials, and most critically, most creatively from the perspective of Western policymakers, the oil price cap mechanism. That mechanism, understand its elegance from the Western perspective, was designed to thread an impossible needle. European nations needed Russian energy to avoid economic catastrophe during the transition away from dependence. But Western powers wanted to deny Russia the revenue that funded its military operations. The solution? Allow Russian oil to continue flowing to global markets, but cap the price at levels that would severely limit Moscow's profits. Russia could sell its oil, avoiding complete market disruption, but only at prices set by its adversaries. $60 per barrel. Take it or leave it. Those are our terms. From Washington's perspective, from Brussels' perspective, this seemed sophisticated, carefully calibrated, even brilliant. A smart power approach that acknowledged economic realities while imposing costs on Russian aggression. From Moscow's perspective, however, this was something else entirely. This was the West declaring unilateral authority to dictate the fundamental terms of global energy trade. This was Western powers exploiting their dominance of financial infrastructure and maritime insurance and shipping logistics, asserting the right to determine what price Russia could charge for its own natural resources. The implicit message, barely, concealed beneath diplomatic language, was unmistakable. You will participate in global markets only on terms we dictate. Violate those terms, and your ships do not sail. Your oil does not reach buyers. Your economy collapses. For nearly 2 years, from early 2023 through most of 2024, Russia absorbed this pressure while the world watched and waited for the inevitable surrender that Western strategists confidently predicted. But Russia was not merely absorbing pressure. Russia was adapting. They redirected export flows toward Asian markets. particularly China and India, nations less committed to Western sanctions regimes. They expanded Arctic shipping capacity, investing billions in icebreaker fleets and northern port infrastructure, developments that most Western analysts dismissed as economically irrational, but which now appear strategically prescient. They constructed new financial mechanisms to bypass Western banking systems, developing alternative payment channels, experimenting with cryptocurrency settlements, building bilateral currency arrangements with trading partners willing to defy Western pressure. These were not merely economic adjustments, tactical responses to temporary sanctions pressure. These were strategic preparations for operating in a fundamentally different global economy. A world where Russian energy would no longer depend on Western permission, Western infrastructure, Western financial intermediation. Russia was preparing for what they viewed as inevitable confrontation, while Western powers assumed sanctions pressure would force capitulation. But something happened in late 2024 that transformed Russian preparation into Russian action. The catalyst came not from Moscow, but from Washington and allied capitals, United States and allied naval forces operating under what they characterized as Sanctions Enforcement Authority began systematically boarding and inspecting tankers suspected of carrying Russian oil priced above the mandated cap, not in Russian territorial waters where Moscow might have expected such actions, not even in disputed zones where legal authority remained ambiguous in international waters, in zones where freedom of navigation had been considered sacrosanct for generations, where commercial vessels had always operated under the protection of their flag states and international maritime law. The justification offered was sanctions enforcement. The practical reality was that economic warfare had crossed a threshold. What had been financial pressure, what had been regulatory constraints had transformed into physical coercion. Naval vessels with weapon systems forcing commercial ships to stop, submit to boarding, allow inspection of cargo and documentation, face potential seizure if found in violation of rules that existed in Western capitals but had never been formally incorporated into international maritime law recognized by Russia or many other nations. Moscow's response was neither impulsive nor emotional. It was methodical, calculated, patient. They documented each boarding. They recorded each assertion of Western authority over vessels Russia considered engaged in legitimate commerce. They compiled legal cases, building arguments about sovereignty violations and maritime law interpretations and precedents being established. And they waited for the opportunity to respond in kind, to demonstrate that what the West characterized as rule-based enforcement looked remarkably like coercion when examined from a different perspective. The catalyst, the specific incident that provided Moscow with the legal and political justification it needed, came in mid-December. An American-operated tanker sailing through northern waters en route from Norwegian ports collided with a Russian research vessel conducting what Moscow characterized as legitimate scientific operations in international waters. The collision resulted in significant damage to the Russian vessel. More critically, more tragically, several Russian crew members died. Sailors killed not in military combat, but in what should have been routine maritime operations. Washington immediately characterized the incident as a tragic accident, maritime collision, of the type that occurs occasionally despite modern navigation systems, regrettable loss of life, but ultimately unintentional contact between vessels operating in challenging northern waters. Moscow, however, alleged something entirely different. They claimed the American tanker was equipped with surveillance equipment far beyond what commercial shipping requires. They suggested the vessel was conducting intelligence collection operations disguised as commercial transit. They demanded the tanker return to Russian custody for criminal investigation of manslaughter charges when the vessel, following instructions from its American operators and United States government officials, refused to comply and instead continued toward Western ports. Russia declared the crew fugitives from justice. Whether you believe Moscow's version, or Washington's version, is in a profound sense almost beside the point. The specific truth of what happened in those northern waters matters legally, certainly matters morally to the families of those killed, but strategically, the incident itself is less important than what Russia did with. Moscow had constructed through careful legal work and strategic patience a framework that justified the actions that followed. By treating the collision as criminal rather than military, by characterizing it as manslaughter rather than an act of war, they created a pathway for responses that could be presented. However, controversially, as lawful policing rather than acts of military aggression, the seizures that followed those 12 simultaneous operations across 3 maritime theaters were not spontaneous reactions to the collision. They were planned operations waiting for justification. Russian naval units moved with the kind of coordination that requires weeks or months of preparation, intelligence on vessel locations and sailing schedules, crew compositions, operational planning for boarding procedures, legal documentation prepared, in advance coordination across multiple commands and geographic zones. This was not improvised response. This was rehearsed execution. Russian ships intercepted the commercial vessels, boarding parties, heavily armed, professionally trained, secured the vessels within minutes, crews numbering in the hundreds across all 12 ships, found themselves suddenly reclassified in Russian legal terminology from commercial sailors to material witnesses in ongoing criminal investigations. Not hostages carefully, not hostages because that term carries specific legal implications under international law, but functionally, practically, strategically. They are bargaining chips in a geopolitical standoff they never volunteered for, never anticipated, never imagined when they signed employment contracts to work on commercial vessels. What Russia has done, understand the profound implications here, is challenge the fundamental assumption that underwrites modern global trade. That assumption, rarely stated explicitly because it has been so thoroughly internalized, is that commercial shipping operates in a protected neutral space. That merchant vessels carrying legitimate cargo under recognized flags enjoy protections that insulate them from conflicts between great powers. That economic activity, commercial exchange, the movement of goods across borders, exists in a separate realm from military competition and political hostility. That assumption held throughout the Cold War, despite decades of intense superpower rivalry. Soviet and American vessels passed each other in international waters without interference. Commercial shipping continued flowing even during crises that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The principle honored by both sides, even when almost nothing else was that commercial maritime activity remained protected. Russia has now deliberately, systematically broken that norm, and they have done so using the exact playbook, the precise logic, the specific precedents that Western powers established over the previous 2 years. Consider the logic that Moscow is deploying, the argument they are making both in formal diplomatic channels and in the court of international opinion. If American naval forces can board tankers under the justification of sanctions enforcement, if they can do so in international waters where those sanctions have never been recognized in treaties or formal international legal processes, then why cannot Russia exercise similar authority under different legal justifications? If Western nations can weaponize their control of financial systems and insurance markets and shipping logistics to enforce price caps, then why cannot Russia use its regional military superiority to enforce its own interpretations of maritime security, criminal jurisdiction, and protective sovereignty? This is what strategic analysts call mirroring, the practice of adopting an adversary's own tactics and turning them back in ways that expose double standards and reveal the self-serving nature of proclaimed universal principles. Russia is forcing Western policymakers to confront a profoundly uncomfortable question, one that cuts to the heart of how international order functions or fails to function. Can you maintain a system where you dictate rules globally, where you enforce those rules through economic and military coercion, but face no reciprocal vulnerability? Can you expect other major powers to simply accept indefinitely a framework where Western interests are protected as universal law, but their interests are dismissed as revisionist aggression? The human cost of this great power competition is already mounting, and it falls as such. Costs always fall on people who made no decisions about policy and exercise, no power over events. Those crew members sitting in Russian custody, hundreds of individuals whose names we do not know, whose faces we have not seen, are human beings with families and mortgages and lives that have been completely upended by decisions made thousands of miles away in capitals they have likely never visited. They went to work expecting another voyage, another paycheck, another few months at sea, followed by time with loved ones. Instead, they find themselves indefinitely detained, caught between great powers, using them as leverage, hoping that their governments and employers can negotiate their release while knowing they are fundamentally powerless over their own fate. When great powers treat commerce as an extension of warfare, when they transform commercial shipping into a theater of conflict, ordinary people pay the price first and most severely. The oligarchs who profit from energy trade will not suffer. The government officials making strategic calculations will not face consequences. The naval officers executing orders will receive commendations. But the sailors, the crew, members, the workers who actually make global commerce function, they are the ones whose lives get destroyed. And here is what keeps me awake at night. What should terrify anyone who understands how international norms either hold or collapse. The precedent being established extends far beyond the immediate conflict between Russia and Western powers. If this logic gains acceptance, if seizure of commercial vessels under contested legal justifications becomes normalized as an acceptable tool of statecraft, maritime shipping enters a fundamentally new and far more dangerous era. Consider the implications. Nearly every commercial vessel sailing today carries electronic equipment that a hostile state could characterize. However, implausibly, as surveillance technology. GPS systems, communications arrays, radar equipment, all the normal infrastructure of modern shipping could be reinterpreted through a hostile lens as intelligence collection capability, environmental regulations, safety, inspections, port state control. These legitimate regulatory frameworks are broad enough, vague enough, contestable enough that they could justify almost any inspection by a coastal state, claiming security concerns. The line between legitimate security enforcement and economic hostage-taking becomes dangerously, perhaps impossibly thin. And once that line blurs, once states begin testing where the boundaries lie, the escalation dynamics become extremely difficult to control. China is watching this crisis with intense interest. So is Iran, so is North Korea, so is every regional power that chafes under perceived Western maritime dominance that resents the American Navy's ability to project power globally while their own forces remain constrained. They are observing how Russia executed these seizures. They are studying Western responses, measuring whether the United States and allies possess the resolve, the capability, the strategic coherence to protect every vessel that might potentially be targeted in future crises. They are calculating whether the enormous costs of directly confronting Western naval power might be avoided by simply seizing commercial vessels and daring the West to escalate. More importantly, more dangerously, they are learning the deeper lesson that when institutional norms crack, when the informal rules and shared assumptions that govern international behavior begin to fracture, the deterioration spreads faster than anyone expects. Each violation that goes unanswered. Each precedent that gets established without effective response becomes the new baseline for acceptable behavior. Each escalation makes the next escalation easier to justify, more natural to contemplate, less shocking to execute. This is precisely how international institutional orders collapse. Not through sudden catastrophic failures, not through dramatic moments that everyone recognizes as turning points, but through gradual erosion of shared assumptions about what constitutes acceptable behavior, through slow accumulation of precedents that individually seem manageable, but collectively transformed the operating environment. Through the death by 1,000 cuts of norms that once seemed unbreakable, but proved far more fragile than anyone imagined. We are watching that process unfold in real time. We are witnessing the steady dissolution of assumptions about maritime security that have governed global commerce for generations. And we are doing so with what appears to be very limited understanding of how to arrest decline, how to rebuild norms once they fracture, how to prevent the transformation from becoming irreversible. The energy markets, those ruthlessly efficient processors of risk and uncertainty, have already absorbed the fundamental lesson. Insurance rates for shipping anywhere near Russian-controlled waters have spiked dramatically, in some cases doubling or tripling within weeks. Some routes, particularly Arctic passages and certain Baltic approaches, have become effectively uninsurable at any price that makes commercial sense. And when routes become uninsurable, they become commercially non-viable regardless of the physical possibility of transit. Capital, investment, shipping contracts, all the infrastructure of modern energy. Logistics is flowing away from integrated supply chains toward fragmented regional systems that price geopolitical risk at every node, every transfer point, every border crossing. For Europe, dependent on energy, logistics that in many cases must transit zones where Russia can assert various forms of control or influence, this represents a strategic nightmare that will take years to fully comprehend. European industries that believed they had successfully diversified away from direct Russian energy dependence are now discovering that their alternative supply chains, their backup sources, remain vulnerable in different ways. The economic costs will mount slowly but relentlessly, showing up in electricity prices and manufacturing competitiveness and inflation rates that seem disconnected from monetary policy but actually reflect these deeper structural disruptions. Here is the deepest irony, the most profound strategic failure embedded in this crisis. The sanctions regime designed to isolate Russia to its economy, to force policy changes through economic coercion, has, through its own enforcement mechanisms, created conditions for Russia to demonstrate a different kind of power. Not the power to compete successfully with Western financial systems or technological capabilities or economic productivity. Russia cannot win that competition. But the power to impose costs, to create chaos, to inject uncertainty into systems that depend on predictability, to force adversaries to operate in permanent elevated alert status that exhausts resources and attention. This is not a sign of Russian strength. This is desperation dressed up as strategic initiative. This is a declining power that has accepted it cannot compete on Western terms. Attempting to change the rules, or at least make following established rules, so expensive, so risky, so operationally complex, that other actors begin questioning whether the international order serves their interests. But desperate powers are often the most dangerous, precisely because they have less to lose from escalation. A confident, secure, rising power exercises restraint because it expects to benefit from stable rules over time. A declining power facing what it perceives as existential threats becomes willing to accept enormous risks, to break norms, to sacrifice long-term reputation for short-term tactical advantage. Russia has apparently concluded that it cannot win a competition based on Western rules, Western institutions, Western frameworks for evaluating economic and political success. So it is attempting to demonstrate that those rules are not universal, that those institutions are not neutral, that the frameworks reflect power relationships rather than objective principles. And they are doing so by turning Western tactics back on their creators, by exposing the contradictions between proclaimed values and actual behavior. By revealing that the rule-based international order functions very differently depending on who is writing and enforcing the rules. What should disturb us most? What represents the gravest failure of American strategic thinking is not Russia's actions themselves, but our own inability to anticipate them. For 2 years, since early 2023, we imposed economic pressure through mechanisms that required physical enforcement. We boarded ships in international waters. We froze assets held in supposedly neutral financial institutions. We dictated prices for commodities we did not produce or own. We did all of this while apparently assuming that our adversaries would simply absorb these costs without developing responses, without learning lessons, without preparing countermeasures. That assumption was not strategy. That was not sophisticated policy analysis. That was wishful thinking masquerading as strategic sophistication. That was the dangerous illusion that American power remains so overwhelming, so unchallengeable, that other major powers have no choice but to accept whatever we impose. The question before us now, the critical uncertainty that will shape global commerce for years or decades to come, is whether this crisis represents a one-time shock that forces recalibration and leads to new understandings about boundaries, or whether this is the beginning of a sustained pattern where commercial shipping becomes routinely targeted, where merchant vessels are regularly seized, where maritime trade operates in permanent uncertainty about which routes are safe and which are vulnerable. Able. The answer depends entirely on choices, not yet made. Diplomatic negotiation could establish clearer boundaries, could create mechanisms for de-escalation, could rebuild some framework for predictable enforcement of agreed rules. Continued escalation, continued tit-for-tat responses, continued attempts by each side to demonstrate resolve through increasingly aggressive actions could normalize seizure of commercial assets as simply standard practice in great power. Competition. We are entering a period, recognize this clearly, where the fundamental assumptions that have governed international commerce for generations no longer reliably hold. Where economic warfare and military power are becoming inseparably intertwined, where every major shipping route potentially becomes a front in conflicts with no clear boundaries, no agreed rules of engagement, no shared understanding of what constitutes escalation versus routine operations. The 12 vessels sitting immobile in Russian custody, those $3 billion in ships and cargo. The hundreds of crew members waiting anxiously for their fate to be determined by negotiations they cannot influence. These are not merely tactical problems requiring diplomatic solutions. They are markers of a profound transformation in how global trade functions and how power gets exercised in international relations. They represent the moment when fragile norms cracked under the pressure of great power competition. They stand as warnings that the institutional order we took for granted, that we assumed was robust and permanent, was always far more fragile than we wanted to believe. The maritime system that enabled modern globalization, that allowed goods to flow relatively freely across borders, that treated commercial shipping as separate from military conflict. That system rested not on treaties or international organizations, but on shared assumptions about acceptable behavior. When major powers stop sharing those assumptions, when they begin viewing commercial shipping not as neutral activity to be protected, but as leverage to be exploited, the entire foundation crumbles. This is not about 12 ships. This is about whether the infrastructure of global commerce can survive the return of great power, competition. This is about whether the economic integration that has defined the last several decades was built on genuine shared interests or merely temporary circumstances that are now ending. This is about whether we can construct some new framework for managing these conflicts, or whether we descend into increasingly chaotic fragmentation. Stay attentive to how this crisis evolves. Stay engaged with the choices our leaders make and the strategies they pursue, because what happens in the coming weeks and months will determine whether we can rebuild some framework for predictable international commerce, or whether we are watching the dissolution of assumptions that have governed trade since World War II. The ships sitting in Russian ports are not just vessels. They are test cases. They are precedents. They are signals of a world being remade. And the question before us is whether that remaking leads toward some new stable order or toward permanent destabilizing. Chaos, where power alone, not law, not shared principles, not negotiated agreements, determines which ships sail safely and which sites seized in foreign ports as bargaining chips in conflicts that never end.